Welcome to Lab 5. There is quite a bit of material in this particular lab, and a lot of it is familiar to you, but a lot of it isn't. And unfortunately, when you see the list of all the things that you're supposed to know, a lot of students just go, that's too much. I can't learn all that stuff. But you can. It is my job to help you with all of these things. The biggest part is going to be over the skull. So we have all of these things having to do with the skull, and then the hyoid bone, because it's got to be somewhere. It doesn't really fit very well anywhere. The vertebral column and the thoracic cage, which is your sternum and your ribs. So a lot of this, like most people know where their sternum is, they know where their ribs are. If you've ever fallen and hit your bottom really hard, you probably found out where your coccyx is. Some of them you may not have ever heard of, like the Palatine Bone or the vomer, the sutures. So my job is to get you familiar with this, and then you just go over it and go over it until you feel comfortable that you can do these. And as always, the quiz will be multiple choice, so you don't have to learn to spell them. Thank goodness. The first page in your lab manual tells you that these tables are terms that are useful but will not be on the test. So I'm going to go ahead and go over some of the terms because you'll be bumping into them as you're learning things. The word tuberosity literally means shaped like a potato. A tuber, a potato. So it is a large rounded projection, and it may or may not be rough. Then you get to a crest. Well, the crest of a hill is the top of the hill, the most prominent part of the hill. The crest of a rooster. So you've seen the word crest before. Probably never seen the word trochanter before. And this is a little bit misleading in this picture right here. So I found you another picture. It's right here. That makes it a little bit easier to see. So a trochanter is a point of attachment that sticks out like this. Here's the lesser one. It's the one that's lower down. And then there's the greater one that's up above. So depending on which book you're looking at, they do call it the trochanter, but they divide it up into the lesser and the greater, which our book does not. Another thing that's different between books is these are called condyles, and on top of it is an area called the epicondyle. But some places they call it the medial epicondyle, and they call it the lateral condyle versus the medial condyle, and that lets you know whether it's towards the inside of the body or towards the outside. So if it's on the outside of the body, then that would be the lateral side, and the medial is the one that would be closer to the middle. So if you were knock-kneed, then these would touch together. So maybe that helps you a little bit because you're going to do medial and lateral on a number of things. And if you can figure out that this is the medial and this is the lateral, then you know that this has to be, if this is the back of the bone, is the posterior view, then you know that this has to be the right leg. Because that's the only way that you could put this in where the medial will be in the middle of your body, the lateral will be on the outside. And then the other thing that gives it away is you have this head that fits into your hip bone, and it allows you to move your leg. So if a tuberosity is a potato shape, then a tubercle is shaped like a little potato. And the epicondyle that we were talking about is on top of the condyle. So there's a condyle. Remember we had the medial and the lateral. And a spine, you guys know like the spine on a porcupine. It is a pointed, slender, sharp projection. And a process is just anything that sticks out. So we're going to be talking about the process that's called a crest, the process that's called a tuberosity. So kind of an odd word, but anyway, that's the way it is. So the reason that these are important is because there are going to be things attached to these processes. So there's a reason that these things stick out or are curved or have a dent in them like that, or a knob, the head on it. There's a reason for the trochanters. So this is one of the reasons why they go over these various things. Now, this particular word, it looks like it should be facet, but you pronounce it facet. Facet with the accent on the second syllable. So we'll learn about those when we get down into the vertebra. Most of you have looked at a diamond, and you look at the facets, the smooth surfaces on the diamond. So you have a multifaceted diamond. So the facets in your bones are going to be smooth, nearly flat, articular surfaces. So articulation is where a bone meets a bone. The head, that's easy. You have the head of the femur. And you're going to see that the shoulder also has a projection out like that. Condyle, we said, was a rounded articular projection. So it is a place where one bone's going to fit inside of another, but it's a little bit rounded. Not nearly as deep as the socket that's going to hold a head, but it is rounded. And a ramus is an arm-like bar of bone. So here's a ramus that makes up part of your lower jaw, your mandible. Now you have openings and grooves or depressions in the bones, and you need to know some of those. So a groove is just a furrow. A fissure is a slit. So most of you have heard the word fissure before, but usually they're talking about a crack in the ice. But this is a fissure in bone. And this word foramen, you're definitely going to know this one. It is a hole. So anywhere you got a hole, it's a foramen. And then if it's a little teeny tiny hole, it's a foramina. So we'll run into that in a minute. A notch, everyone knows about notches, I hope. So we'll run into notches. The word meatus, you will learn that if you haven't already learned it when you're talking about the nose. You have the canal that your air goes through. You breathe up through your nose and it goes back and then it goes, into your lungs eventually. So the area the little passageway that it goes through is called a meatus, or you have several meatuses in your nose. So anything that looks like a canal-like passage, just think about your nose. And you've got it. A sinus, everyone knows about sinus infections and sinus headaches. It is a hole. A sinus is a hole. So I remember when some guy was wanting to date me and he said something like, "Oh, man, I have a sinus headache. I get so many of those." And I just looked at him and said, "Oh, I don't have any sinuses." And he just looked at me like I was an idiot, and he started dating my girlfriend. So I do have sinuses, but they're not infected like his were. So it's a cavity within a bone, and it's filled with air, but it's lined with mucous membrane. So you guys, you know that one too. And then a fossa is, let's see, when are we going to do a fossa? When you guys learn about the scapula, you're going to learn the fossa right here. Kind of looks like an angel wing. And here's your hip, and you have a fossa there. So it's to me, I would just call it like a cup-like area. And you got another fossa down here, but you can't hardly see it because of this bone right here, this process sticking out. And here's a hole, so that's a foramen. Spine, it's a little ridge there. Right there, there's your spine. So you're probably sitting there going, why in the world did this lady talk on for 10 minutes about things that the lady who makes out the test said won't be on the test? So the reason is, you'll thank me later, as we go through all of these things, we're going to be talking about fossas and processes and sutures and condyles. So it really helps you to know, and foramen. So if you know what they are, then it helps you find them more easily. Now, some of these are going to be fairly easy. Whenever we talk about the areas of the skull, the front of the brain, or where the front of the skull is and the front of the brain is, those are called the frontal regions. So it's your frontal lobe, and the bone over it is the frontal bone. Now, interestingly enough, you guys have all of these bones, but because I'm as old as I am, I don't have all these bones. I don't have all these suture lines. My skull is as smooth as a baby's bottom because I'm so old and my bones have remodeled enough times to where I've lost all these suture lines that you guys are going to be learning. So your skull is changing over time. And you kind of know that anyway, because think of a little baby. They have that little fontanelle, or the soft spot on the top of the head, where these bones haven't even grown together yet. So you have to be very careful with a baby not to put too much pressure on the fontanelle, because there's no skull there. All right, when you come over to the parietal region, this is the back part. So here's the frontal, and there's the parietal right there. And if you come on around to the back of the skull, this is kind of odd because it's leaning backwards, because normally this region right here would be right here if this person was standing upright. But because the skull is leaning backwards, it kind of looks like it's on the bottom, and it's not. It's on the back of the skull. And this is called the occipital region. And I always want the students to know where the occipital region is, because one of the things that you see people do, especially, it seems like in Walmart, I don't know, but the kid will be going through the aisle and they're like, I want this, and they're grabbing things, and the parents are having to take it away and put it back, and the kid's trying to hide it, and the kid's screaming, and then the parent reaches back with their hand, because this is a little kid, and they smack them on the back of the head and say, I told you not to do that. And then, of course, the kid even cries harder. But the reason I worry about that, the reason this is called the occipital region and the occipital bone, is because if you hit someone in the occipital region, this is the part that processes the information coming in from the eyes. So the information comes from the eyes and is processed here. So you see here, you get the light, you get the impulses and all of that, but you process it and understand it here. So if you hit a kid in the back of the head in the occipital region, you can blind them. So even though their eyes are okay and their eyes still pick up light, the part of the brain that understands what they're seeing is damaged, and you don't regrow your brain. So if you see people smacking their kid in the back of the head in the occipital region, warn them. Say, do not do that. You could blind your child. All right, and everyone knows where the temples are on your on either side of your eye. So a lot of times, if you have a headache, you'll find yourself massaging the temple area. You'll just be kind of rubbing right around by the outside of your eye. So that bone that's over that particular area is called the temporal bone. So frontal bone, if you've watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you'll know what the frontal bone is, and the frontal area of the skull. because in there, if somebody misbehaves, they do a frontal lobotomy on them. They literally cut open their skull through the frontal bone and take out this part of the brain. And then you don't have any problem with the person. They can still feed themselves, they can still go to the bathroom, they live a normal life, except for you just took their will away. So if you haven't seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you gotta see it. It's such an excellent movie. And it'll just make you so mad. You'll leave when I watched it, I left the theater fuming and crying, both. Because I was just like, they can't do that to people. They can't. It's not okay. But anyway, but it has a lot of good stuff in it too. It's not like a downer. All right, so frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. If you memorize it for the skull, you've got it for the brain, because those are the same regions. All right, and then coming down into the jawbone right here. This is cool. Look at this little tiny hole right there. That's called the mental foramen. A mental has to do with thinking, or your brain, and foramen is a hole. Now, why in the world the hole in your jaw is called a mental foramen, I don't know. But anyway, I think it's kind of fun. All right, this whole bone is known as the mandible, and the one above it is the maxilla. And unfortunately, kids get those two confused. Maxilla and mandible. They both start with M, and they both have to do with the jaw and your teeth. So whatever it takes for you to remember, the mandible is the bottom, and the maxilla is on the top. So you have to figure out a little trick that will help you with that. And here we have 21 is the Coronoid process, and 22 is the mandibular condyle. See, there's that word, condyle. So mandibular condyle and coronoid process. I don't have any brilliant way of helping you remember those. So you're on your own. Now, you've probably noticed somebody who has absolutely gorgeous cheekbones. I'm trying to think, I think most of you have seen Angelina Jolie, and I think she has some of the most amazing cheekbones right there. A lot of people go to plastic surgeons and try to have some put on, but they just never quite look right. But hers are so beautiful right there, and that's because there's a bone pushing out right there. So here you go. If you just strip away the skin, there's the cheekbone right there, and it is called the zygomatic bone. Let's see, the bone coming off, that's the zygomatic arch right there. So you have an arch coming off of that. So zygomatic, if you can remember that, you got two of the bones. And if you can remember Angelina Jolie, you got it nailed. This one's really hard. I don't even know how to tell you how to remember that the nasal bone is called the nasal bone. I guess they just ran out of Latin words. Now, if you look inside the eye socket right here, you've got a little bone right here, number 14, and that's the lacrimal bone. Lacrimal. And those of you who are Catholic, here is something interesting. I found this on Wikipedia, so you know that it's good and it's accurate. So, lacrimosa comes from Our Lady of Sorrows, which is a title given to the Virgin Mary. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So people who attend Mass, they learn a lot of Latin. And you're going to find that a lot of the words that we're using are Latin. So if you can remember that the lacrimal gland is the tear gland, the sorrow. So your tears come in this area, And right behind it, right behind the lacrimal bone, is the ethmoid bone. I have no trick for memorizing that one. You're on your own. Ethmoid. And behind the ethmoid over here, you have the sphenoid. Sphenoid. The PH sounds like an F, so you're sphenoid. Here is the greater wing of the sphenoid. As you can see, there are many suture lines. It looks like, literally, looks like somebody sewed the bones together. And this is very tough connective tissue that holds it so that you don't have hardly any give in the skull, which is nice because it's protecting our brain, but it's bad because if you have swelling in the brain due to an infection or you're in a wreck and you bruise your brain in the wreck, it can't swell. Or if you get cancer, even if it's not a malignant cancer, any tumor in the brain is going to cause damage because it pushes up against the skull. So, and then of course, in people like me, the sutures are missing. So the 4 that you guys need to know, one of them is the squamoid, or they call it squamous here, but it's the squamoid suture right there. And if you look at that, that kind of looks like a squamous cell. When we did the histology and you looked at squamous cells, they were flat and they were kind of irregular, kind of like this. So maybe that'll help you remember the squamous suture. Squamous suture. Now this one's going to be really easy because in the first lesson we learned about coronal and sagittal cuts. So coronal looks like you're wearing a crown. So that one should be fairly easy. Scrolling down and looking at this one, there's the sagittal. So the coronal was up here. We can't see it anymore. There's the sagittal. And then they have rotated the skull so that you can see this area right here, the occipital region. So there's the parietal occipital region. And for those of you who learned Greek letters, like you know fraternities and sororities, the Greek symbol lambda is an upside down Y. So they call this the lambdoid suture. Lambdoid, because it looks like a lambda. So this part's the sagittal, and this part going in both directions is the lambdoid. This is confusing because they say number 1 is the parietal region. You're like, well, wait a minute, where is it? I can't see it. So if you guys are printing this out, the parietal should be number 2, and the occipital should be number 3. Since you guys are in the computer literate generation, you probably won't have any trouble with this next one. You have a stylus that you can use to write if you want to do something on your phone or if you want to do something on your tablet. So most of you know a stylus is kind of like a pencil. And so you have the styloid process. So remember, process just means something that sticks out. And this is the styloid process right here. And if you look over here, there's the matching one over there. So kind of looks like a little pencil hanging down. In this picture, you can see the coronal suture, no problem. And you can see the squamous or squamal suture right there. No problem with that one either. But you cannot see the lambdoid suture because it's the one that comes off and makes that Y shape. Coming here and then making the Y shape back there. So, well, okay. You can see a little bit of it right there. But that other picture's a whole lot better down here. That makes it a lot clearer when you see it like that, instead of trying to look at this little piece of it and go, well, that's the edge of it right there. So the only one we haven't talked about yet in this particular picture is this one right here, and that one is your external acoustic meatus, although some people call it the external auditory meatus. So acoustic, auditory, they both have to do with hearing, so obviously this is going to be involved with your hearing. Now here's where it gets a little tricky, because you guys learned the maxilla and the mandible, but you need to know it from different orientations. So this, again, is going to be your maxilla, your upper jaw, with your upper teeth in it, right there. So a lot of times when you flip it over, it's like, oh, I have no idea what that is. And you're like, oh, wait a minute, duh, there's the teeth. That's the maxilla, because it's the top. 17 is the Palatine Bone. And you're going to, when we do tonsils, you're going to find out you have Palatine tonsils. So they name everything in that area Palatine, the bone, the tonsils, and things like that. And the vomer, V-O-M-E-R, vomer. And I guess you can kind of remember that one because when you vomit, it goes past there and out your mouth. Maybe that'll help you. The other thing that's kind of cool is some animals have teeth there. They have vomer teeth there. And so they can, if they get something in their mouth, they can hook those back teeth in it and it's not leaving. They got a hold of it. When we were looking over here at this picture, here is the sphenoid. Remember the funny one that has the F sound? Sphenoid. And now, okay, here's your zygomatic arch, zygomatic bone that gives you your cheekbones. Now, when we go over here, there's the zygomatic bone. Like, the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid. There's the zygomatic, you can still get that one. That one's still pretty easy. And the arch, the zygomatic arch, is actually easier to tell in this one. Although you have to know that that's a cheekbone because there's the upper jaw. So sphenoid, right there. That one's hard because it's really hard to look at this one right here. But if you look, it's that part right there. Showing right there. And don't forget, you have it on both sides. So don't think, oh, well, there's one over here. And then if they put the number 10 over here, you're like, well, wait a minute. Where did it go? I can't find it. So this is supposed to be 10 here and 10 here. And this is supposed to be 62 there and 62 there for the greater wing. So it's a little bit of a typo there. So I went out on the internet and found a picture because we're getting into an area that's going to be a little bit confusing to you unless we step back and look a little bit. So we can always use our zygomatic bone, our cheekbone, to help us orient where we are. And then this is kind of nice because it shows the skin a little bit and it shows the bones a little bit. So you can see the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the temporal bone, and the occipital bone. So you can see that to kind of orient yourself. And then behind the ear, you can reach back there and feel it. You have a mastoid process. So it's behind the ear. So if you can find this canal and then find the bone that's kind of sticking out behind it posteriorly, then you may be able to find the mastoid process a little bit more easily. The other thing that's really confusing is if you look at that upside down skull and you're just looking at the maxilla, the upper jaw, that's it right there. But if you look at the lower jaw, here's the lower jaw, And look, it comes all the way up, all the way back here. So it's huge in comparison. But we tend to think, well, it's the same size as this one. And then you get all confused because over here by the ear, they've got the mandible. And you're like, what? No. The mandible's over there in the front. Well, it extends all the way back here. Right there. So I wanted to step away and have you look and think about that. And then we'll go back to that one where we're looking at the upside down picture of the skull. So orienting yourself with the maxilla, come back here, and here is where the mandibular fossa is. So this is where we're going to attach the mandible in this region right here. Okay, and again, because you have two sides, this is the same as this. So don't get confused if you memorize this one and then they put this one on the test and you're like, oh, wait a minute, I don't know what that one is. Well, it's the same as that one right there. And your styloid process, because it is pointing down at you, you really can't tell. But remember that thing that was hanging down, almost looked like a fang or something that was hanging down. That's where those are. And let's see, we've got that one. So I'm positive that you guys don't drink. So you wouldn't know what a magnum was. But it's large, and foramen is a hole. So one of the largest holes in the skull, it's really easy to find, is the Foramen Magnum. And this is going to allow the brain to talk to the spinal cord. So this is the opening that allows that right there. And on either side of the Foramen Magnum, you have the Occipital Condyles. Occipital Condyles. So this whole area right here is the occipital region. Remember the back of the head where you don't want to slap a kid because you could cause them to go blind? So it extends all the way up, and then there's the condyles right there. This particular picture is a little bit hard to see because when you start looking for 47 and 48 over here, and 47 and 48 over here, you can't see them. So you realize, oh, the skull is tilted slightly. So it's tilted slightly towards your left. If you're looking at the piece of paper, it's towards your left. So you don't see these openings right here. Right there, but you do over here. So here is the big opening for the spinal cord, and over here, number 48, is the jugular foramen. So you've got to get blood to the brain, so you've got your jugular hole right there, so the jugular can come on up through there. Now, as you can see, there's all sorts of foramen. There's all sorts of holes that allow you to get blood up to the brain and so on. But you only have to know the jugular one and the Foramen Magnum because, I mean, obviously it's the biggest one. And then 47 is the Carotid Canal right there. So the carotid can nestle down. A canal is like a ditch. So it's a place you can lay something down in it and protect it. And you really want to protect your carotid for sure. So mastoid process on either side. The jugular foramen. The other one on the other side you can't see. Styloid process. If you could see it from the side, you'd see that it sticks out. All right, so I think we've got all of these things covered. Remember, this is the palatine area, palatine, and we're going to have palatine tonsils in this region. And remember, vomiting, the vomer region. So here we go again. Now we've cut the skull open, so now we can get inside and we can look at some of the cool stuff that's inside. So again, this stuff hasn't changed. This is still the frontal lobe right there, where the frontal lobe of the brain's going to be. It's the frontal bone. And the occipital is still back here where you don't hit the kid. And the temporal is over your temples right there. And you can't see the parietal because it's on the top. And we've cut the top of the head off. So, in there. All right, the sphenoid, there we go with the sphenoid again, 10. And the ethmoid is number 15. There, ethmoid. Now we're going to look at two things. The cristagalli, this one, and my favorite, the Cribriform Plate. And the reason I like the Cribriform Plate is because this is where the nose talks to the brain. And in order to do that, it has all these little holes in the Cribriform Plate so that you can connect the brain up above the Cribriform Plate with the nose below that. And I was in a trivial contest, and they were talking about, well, where is the part of the face or the skull that allows you to detect odors, or the olfactory region. And I'm like, oh, I know that one. It's the Cribriform Plate. And all the people that were in my team were looking at me like, I think they just want us to say nose. I think that's all they want. And sure enough, that was the answer. But I thought Cribriform Plate would have been so much better. So once again, I went out on the internet because you really can't see this in the picture in the lab manual. But the Cribriform Plate is absolutely full of holes to allow the olfactory nerves to talk to the brain. So you've got to have a way for them to get up to the brain. And then there's there's the cristagalli, and then the Cribriform Plates on either side. And here's how it looks in the picture that you'll be seeing on the lab exam. Right there. So you can see the cristagalli, and then you just know that the Cribriform Plates are on either side, and they're absolutely full of Swiss cheese holes. In this particular picture, you can see the jugular foramen quite a bit easier than you could in that other one. And you see that they're rather large, but not nearly as large as the Foramen Magnum. Still my favorite. One of the last labs that we're going to do is dealing with the cranial nerves, and they are numbered 1 through 12. And the 12th cranial nerve is the hypoglossal nerve, and it's the one that lets your tongue work. So luckily, my tongue is still just going and going. And you need some way for that to be able to get from the brain down to the tongue. And so you've got the Hypoglossal Canal, which is kind of hard to see there. It's actually a foramen, it's actually a hole, but there's a canal that it lays in, and then it goes on through the hole, through the foramen, right there. And of course, there's one on the other side, right there, because you want both sides of your tongue to work. And you know that people who have a stroke, one side doesn't work and the other does, usually, unless it's a massive stroke. Again, it's kind of hard to tell from this picture, but 67 is pointing to the internal acoustic meatus, or internal auditory meatus. And remember, we saw that before up here in this one, but it was the external acoustic meatus here, external. And then if you go on the inside, and remember there's your stylus, the styloid process. So that's so hard to see when you're looking at the skull upside down because you don't see that projection. I just wanted to point that out again because I don't want you to miss that one. So you'll remember that 10 was the sphenoid bone, and then you had your greater wing, which was 62, kind of like an angel wing. So that would be fairly easy. But then you have your lesser wing. So 61 is the lesser wing. So the greater wing and the lesser wing and the sphenoid. So don't get those three mixed up. Whatever it takes for you to sort those out, sort those out. And last but not least, we come to this area right here, which is known as the sella turcica. And this is kind of interesting because your pituitary sits there. So the pituitary is so incredibly important that it has this extra bony pocket just for it to sit in. But interestingly enough, if you are in an accident or if you're delivering a baby and you're bearing down really, really hard, sometimes the pituitary can actually pop out of the sella turcica. So it's called an empty sella syndrome when they go looking for your pituitary and it's not sitting in the pocket where it's supposed to be. So sella turcica. It almost to me sounds like the cellar of your house, like the basement. So it's just this pocket for the pituitary to sit in. So when we do the endocrine system, you're going to find out how incredibly important the pituitary is. So what I'm trying to do is to give you things that will put this stuff in your mind and help you remember it. So I don't want you to just memorize it for the test and then totally forget it because you need to know this stuff. But it's also important to know it from different angles. So we looked earlier at the vomer, and I told you that some people in the back of their mouth have a tooth actually hanging out there. So now if you look at the front, look at the vomer right there. There's your vomer. And there's your ethmoid. These things look so different from different angles. So if I were you, when I was studying, I would put my this virtual lab with all the answers in it, and I would scan back and say, okay, what does the nasal bone look like in this picture? Well, I mean, that one's going to be pretty easy. It's the nasal bone right there. And then coming off of it, the ethmoid and the vomer bone. So not too bad. The frontal region is still the frontal region, so that's going to be great. The cheekbones, zygomatic bone, still a zygomatic bone, so still no problem there. The arch coming off, arching off of it, right there. Maxilla and mandible, still there. There's the mental foramen, right there, the little holes right there. So far, this is all the same thing, but this is going to throw you because that isn't at all what it looks like when we see it from other angles. So you're like, whoa. And the sphenoid? So it actually makes up the back of your eye socket. How about that? And again, anytime you need the front, like your eyes and things like that, to be able to talk to the brain itself, you're going to have to poke a hole in the skull. You're going to have one. So the 39 is the superior orbital fissure. So remember we talked about cracks in the ice. This looks like a crack in the skull right there. So it's a fissure. And it is the superior one because it's at the top of the eye socket. superior is on top, and remember, inferior. So it's kind of hard to see the inferior one here. You'd actually need to, if you were in the lab, you could take the skull and you could rotate it around. You can see this more easily. But there's the inferior and there's the superior. And this area is called the orbital, believe it or not, the orbital region, because it's round, like an orbit is round. So when we talk about the muscles, we talk about other things like that, we're going to talk about the orbital. So just think of a space shuttle, I don't know, or somebody rolling their eyes. So superior and inferior orbital fissure. All right, so I think we covered all of those things. So you're going to have a 20-point quiz just on the bones of the skull, and it's one that you can't drop. So at the end of the semester, you're going to be able to drop one of your quizzes, and this one is not one that you'll be able to drop. So that's why I spent plenty of time going over the skull and trying really hard to make sure that you guys had it cold. All right, so now we're going to look at the vertebra. So here is an overview of what your spinal cord travels through. These are your vertebra all the way down to your coccyx. So the first 7 they call the cervical vertebra. And this is confusing. The first time I heard it, it was like, wait a minute, my cervix is that thing that is, because I'm a female, it's the opening to my uterus. It's where babies come out. And so when somebody was talking about a cervical dislocation, I thought that something drastically had gone wrong down there. And cervical dislocation is another name for breaking your neck. So anyway, so this is your cervical region also. And guys have this cervical region just like girls do. And you have 7 bones that make up the cervical region. Your head rests on the atlas, which is the first cervical vertebra. The second cervical vertebra is the axis. So the atlas supports the weight of the world, or in this case, the weight of your head. And the axis allows your head to turn. Now, interestingly enough, you know that you have disc. You can actually see the disc that they drew in here. But you don't have disc between the atlas and the axis. So if you get your dog's not barking and your kid's not crying, and you sit quietly and turn your head, you will actually hear those 2 bones rub against each other. And that name for that sound that you hear with bone rubbing on bone is crepitate. And if you're old and you've lost a lot of the cartilage in between your bones, a lot of your bones rub together. And so they say the person is decrepit because their bones rub together. So your atlas and axis fit together. So we're going to look at the picture in just a second, but I thought if you looked at the picture, it would not make any sense to you. But if you look at it this way, you see the dens, D-E-N-S, like your kitchen, living room, and den. This is the dens of the axis sticking up through the atlas. So it actually sticks up. And when you turn your head, this is rotating back and forth around the dens. So it's kind of important to know what's what with the atlas and the axis, and the fact that there is no disc in that region. And then each vertebra as you go down there's the C2 is the axis, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7. And you notice the process is getting longer and longer and longer the further down you go, right there. And then if you switch over to this picture, see these processes sticking out there like that. So we're going to be looking at the different processes because you're going to be able to tell whether you're in the cervical region, the thoracic region, the lumbar region, which is your lower back, and then the sacral region. And the sacrum is actually fused in there with the coccyx hanging off the back end of it. So here is a disarticulated vertebral column. Disarticulated means you've taken the bones apart. So there's your atlas right there, the weight of your skull resting upon it, and there's the side view of it. So you can see these projections from two different angles. So there's one projection and there's one projection. But you can't see this one because of the angle. So you have to look at it from this angle. But it's back there. All right. And then the axis, remember, has a dens on it right there. And we know that it's going to sit up in through there so that you can turn your head around. So this is what it looks like from the side. Now you don't know which picture that you might get on the test. You may get this one right here, but this should give it away, the dens, because it's the only one with the dens on it. And this one should give this away because look at all these other spiny processes and the body here that this one's missing. So they clearly look different. It's just staring at them for a while and try to figure out, how is this one different from this one? How is this one different from that one? Well, one of the things that should give it away right there is the body. The lumbar body is huge. Let me move that up a little bit for you. There you go. Look how big that is. And the foramen, the whole, look how small it is. Whereas look at the body here. This is more of a oval, and this is almost like a heart shape for this one. So the lumbar, the ones in the your lower back, lumbar is lower back. Hey, it even looks like lower back. Thoracic, that's the ones around your lungs in that area. So, and it's got these big wings, really large wings in the thoracic area. So, I don't know. To me, this almost looks like a bird sitting with its wings out. So, whatever it takes for you to remember, that's thoracic. So, if it was this way, the foramens give it away. Because the closer you are to the head, you're going to have a larger area because you have the cerebrum, the cerebellum, but you have the medulla oblongata, you've got the brainstem, and then you've got the spinal cord. So you've got to have room. And then when you finally get down to the lowest region of the vertebral column, the spinal column actually fans out into a horse's tail. It looks just like a horse's tail, so you don't need as much room down there, so you don't have to have as big of a foramen. But you've got the weight of the whole body sitting on the body of this vertebra. All right, so that's one of the easy ways to tell which is which if you're looking at it from this direction. But now when you turn it on its side, you can't really see the body as well. Although you can see that this one is more of a cube and this is more of a rectangle. And this one, it looks like an origami project that some kid did poorly. So if it's funny looking, it's cervical. Let's just put it that way. And if it is a square body, it's thoracic. If it's rectangular, it's lumbar. So that's one way you can do it. You can also look at this process on the thoracic. That's huge. That is so huge compared to these. So look at the spinous process in each one. So just spend a little time looking at it, and then you can look at this without looking at the answers. So you can figure out which it is. Over here, this is the key, but over here, it gives them to you without the key. Oh, well, I see the dens, so I'm good with that one. And I see this, so I know that that's the atlas, because it's got the weight of your whole head on it. This one's huge down here, so I know that that's in the lumbar region, right there. And this is rectangular. So if you just spend a little time, you shouldn't have too much trouble with them. But those are the things that I look for when I'm having to name whether it's thoracic or lumbar or cervical. So here we have the sternum, which you and I would call your breastbone. At one time, this was individual bones, but as you went from being a little kid on through puberty, you fused them into one big bone. Except for they don't have the xiphoid process there, which is interesting. So here you go. The upper part is called the manubrium. Up here's the manubrium. And there's the clavicular notch. So your clavicle is going to be coming in off of here and hook up. So your clavicle and your sternum meet. And again, of course, on the other side. The jugular notch. So I need my jugular to go through there. So it's protected by bone. And then this is just the body. And this little piece right here that isn't showing is a xiphoid process. So we got to see that. All right, this puts everything hopefully in more perspective. So there is your manubrium right there. And then there's the clavicular area where the clavicle joins in right there. And this piece right here is a xiphoid process. And my understanding is if you do CPR on someone, you're pushing in this area. And you're pushing so hard that there's a good chance you'll break the xiphoid process when you're doing CPR. But it's easily enough to reattach. So it would be better to save the person's life than to worry about whether or not you're breaking this little tip of the sternum off. So this whole thing is a sternum. There's the body of it. And there's the xiphoid process. And then the ribs, we're going to look at the ribs in just a minute. They're going to attach in the back. And then they're going to come around. And they're going to be attached here by basically gristle. It's actually called costal cartilage. Costal cartilage. But you and I, if we were eating something, we bit into something that bounced off our teeth like that, we say, ooh, I just bit into a gristle. The last of your vertebra are the sacral vertebra, and they're fused, as you see. So they look like one big bone, except for the coccyx, which, if you fall down, quite frequently breaks, and there's no way to set the bone. So whichever way it decides to reattach to the sacrum, that's the way you're going to wear it for the rest of your life. Just like the sternum had a body, here's the body right there. And this has the holes right there so that you can allow nerves to pass through. So the sacral foramen. Again, anytime you see the holes, you know it's a foramen. And since this is the sacrum, those are sacral foramen. You have a superior sacral canal, and then you have a sacral hiatus. A hiatus is a well, there's several definitions for it. It is a gap, but where you're most probably, if you've ever heard the word before, you have a hiatus or a hiatal hernia, and it's kind of an opening where your stomach extends up where it should not be. There should be division between the esophagus and the stomach. There should be a membrane holding all of that in place. And sometimes you have the stomach protruding up, and so stomach acid will be pushed up into the esophagus. So you end up with heartburn, which has nothing to do with your heart. It has to do with backed up stomach acid in your throat. So now what you have to do with the rib is to figure out which end is going to attach to the vertebral column and which is the end that's going to go around and attach to the sternum. And remember, it doesn't connect directly. It attaches via some costal cartilage or some gristle connective tissue. So coming back to this picture, you know that the front of your body is the anterior. You know your clavicles and your sternum are in the front of your body, the anterior. And your posterior will be back there where your spinal column is, back there where your vertebral column is. So when you're looking at the disarticulated rib, you don't have a clue as to which end is which, except remember that tubercle that stuck out? There's where it fits in, right there and right there. So your rib articulates in two places in the back, in the posterior. And then it comes around and attaches to the costal cartilage in the front. So when you see this picture, you know the head articulates with the vertebra, as does the tubercle. And this is going to be the front end, the anterior end, which will be attached with costal cartilage to the sternum. And this is the hyoid bone. It's the only bone that does not articulate to another bone. But what's really interesting about the hyoid bone is if you've watched any TV shows where somebody is strangled, then they go, oh, clearly this person was killed by strangulation because the hyoid bone is broken, and the only way you can break the hyoid bone is if you strangle somebody or hang them. But if you're under the age of 18, your bones are still so flexible that you can be strangled to death and it won't break your hyoid bone. So they need to put that little thing, a little fact there when they're doing those TV shows. Or only kill people over 18, and then it's okay because then you can have their hyoid bone broken. So there are those costal cartilages that I was talking about. Your xiphoid process, the body of the sternum, the manubrium. You can't see the clavicles because they're not on this particular one, but they would be coming in right there in the clavicular notch. And they call these true ribs because they truly articulate. But then when they get down to these lower ones, they are known as false ribs or floating ribs. So the 1 through 7 true ribs actually articulate in the front and the back with a bone. But if you come down here, this one does not articulate with the sternum. It articulates with some more costal cartilage. So these are all considered to be false because they don't directly articulate, but they all branch off of this. And then you have two of them they call floating ribs, and they're not even attached, except in the back there. So these 8 through 12 are called false ribs, with 5 of them being false ribs and 2 of them being floating ribs. So find this page in your lab manual and go through it and see which things you know. So coccyx, most people have that one, so you can go check, and you don't have to go back and look at that one anymore. The sternum, All you need to do is make sure you know where the body is, the manubrium, the clavicular notch, the jugular notch, and the xiphoid process. So that one, piece of cake. Ribs, you have to know which is the anterior end, the one that comes around to the front to the sternum, and which is the head, which is the one that goes around to the back to the vertebra. The tubercle, which is another place where it articulates. And then the 7 pairs of true ribs, 5 pairs of false ribs, and 2 pairs of floating ribs. Hyoid bone, that's the one, put your hands around your neck like you're going to strangle yourself, and you've got your hands around your hyoid bone. You have to know 4 sutures. Well, the coronal one is the easy one because it looks like you're wearing a crown. Sagittal looks like it splits your skull between your eyes going backwards. The lambdoid looks like a lambda. It looks like the upside down Y. And the squamous is over there kind of behind your ear, and it kind of looks like a squamous epithelial cell made out of bone. So that one shouldn't be too much of a problem. In the mandible, you need to know the coronoid process, the mandibular condyle, and the mental foramen. Well, I don't think you'll have any trouble with the mental foramen because that's a hole in your jaw. So that one's pretty easy. And in the sphenoid bone, you need to know the greater wing, the lesser wing, and nobody should miss the sella turcica because that's where the pituitary sits. It's that little cave that's made just to fit the pituitary. And the superior and inferior orbital fissure, the vomer bone, the palatine, ethmoid. When you're looking at the ethmoid, look at the Cribriform Plate and the cristagalli. So the cristagalli is in the middle, and then the wholly punched out pieces on the left and the right of it are the Cribriform plates. And in the maxilla, they put the inferior orbital fissure in the maxilla region instead of the sphenoid. But it's kind of hard. I mean, you're in the orbital hole where the eyeball is, and the top is the superior and the inferior. But anyway, and the nasal bone, everybody's going to get that one, unless you overthink it and you're like, oh my gosh, it can't just be nasal. It has to be something else. And it really is just nasal. The cheekbone, zygomatic bone, frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. You need to know those. And the temporal's got all kind of activity going on because you've got the hearing parts, the internal and external auditory meatus. You've got the zygomatic arch, styloid process. So, but now, hopefully, when you look at this, you're not overwhelmed going, oh my gosh, I can never memorize all that. So good luck. I've given you all the hints that I know, and now it's just you sitting down and going over it and going over it and going over it over until you've got it cold. So good luck.